County, a place I want to stay. Its far north gate and southern trails came Walker Boone and Kenton too. Kentucky, she is calling, a place of history. Oh, Kentucky, Kentucky County, a place to work and play. Oh, Kentucky, Kentucky County, a place I want to stay. I'm John Stephenson. June Geiman and I are glad to be back off our trip across Kentucky. We traveled some 42,000 miles gathering the history of Kentucky, county by county, and its tourism attractions. We hope you will appreciate the films of the history of Kentucky by your congressional districts as much as we appreciated the opportunity of traveling through Kentucky some 42,000 miles. Thank you. Now enjoy the history of Kentucky. At this time, let me introduce to you, to give you an overview of Kentucky history, Dr. Thomas Clark.
Dr. Clark, we want to thank you for being with us.
I'm happy to be with you.
What can you tell us? We have been to every county in Kentucky. We've collected the information about the history of each county. We've come to you, Mr. History, to help us close our documentation on Kentucky by telling us a little bit how Kentucky itself got formed.
Well, Kentucky had a bit of a nebulous beginning. This was a wide open, unexplored wilderness territory on this side of the mountains. You begin to see an opening of the door as early as the middle decades of the 18th century. By 1760, Kentucky was gradually coming into focus, and by 1770, it was pretty well explored by the long hunters that came in, and then of course that famous party, they were long hunters too, of Daniel Boone and John Finley, who came into this state. Now, contrary, I think, to popular belief, this was not a region unmarked by no trails or no landmarks. There were buffalo traces, Indian traces across the state. As you know, no major Indian tribe occupied this state. This was a borderland between the northern Indians, the Shawnees with all their associated tribes, and the southern Chickasaw, are grouped to the south. And there was a great deal of rivalry between them to claim this hunting ground. Now, Kentucky, you know, geographically is of a highly varied nature, highly sectionalized nature. This central cane land here, or what you know as the Bluegrass Plateau, was a very famous grazing ground. There were salt licks scattered around all over the state where animals congregated, and the skin trade, the Indian trade, was a fairly rich one that originated here. In the early records, you have stories of the long hunters pursuing both the fur trade and the skin trade, but the major emphasis was upon the skin trade itself. Then, of course, in the middle of the 18th century, the rivalry between the French and the British, and you began to having those land speculators or surveyors like Thomas Walker, Christopher Gist coming into the region, making those preliminary so-called surveys in quotation marks. From 1760 on, the British were in control of this territory. The British undertook to check population expansion in this direction in the proclamation of 1763, which they were unsuccessful in doing. After 1770, you had a population movement into this region with the establishment in 1774 and 75 of Harrodsburg, or Harrodstown, and Boonesboro, Logan's Fort, and then Bryan Station, Lexington Fort. We're standing right now almost on the ground where the Lexington Fort was located. From that time on, there was a great population movement into this region that you know as Kentucky, concentrated largely in this central bluegrass area. But population in time was to expand into other areas of the state.
What were the first counties in Kentucky?
Well, Kentucky County was the first one in 1776. That was simply a blanket. Well, I believe back of that there was Fincastle County. But Kentucky County was simply a blanket spread of Virginia authority into this western country. Then in 1780 they were created the first three counties, Fayette, Lincoln, and Jefferson counties. Fayette County covered all the area north of the Kentucky River. Lincoln County, the area east of Benson's Creek, and Jefferson County south of the Kentucky River and west and south of Benson's Creek. Benson Creek's mouth is just opposite, about where that office plaza is in Frankfort at the present time.
Okay. During the interview, we're standing on West Main Street, which is right across from the old Fayette County Courthouse. What is the significance of this area, Dr. Clark?
We're standing in a very historic spot here. Right here to my right, where this Radisson Hotel is located, is the site of the old Fort Lexington. It was built here on this town creek with trim cane all around it. They cleared the cane all around it, build a fort, and give them visibility, not to be surprised by a sneak Indian attack. Right to my right, on the corner of Main and Mill Street, is where the office of the True American stood. That was an anti-slavery paper published by Cassius M. Clay here in the very heart of Kentucky slavery, which that office was raided illegally so, in violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution. It was packed up. Later on, the courts granted Cassius M. Clay restitution, and he collected damages for it. To my back is Cheapside. Cheapside has a long and romantic history. Here within 50 feet of where we are standing was the scene of the slave auctions, where slaves were sold out of this bluegrass region to the expanding cotton belt in the south. It's also the scene of the great court day markets in which the livestock trade was carried on. This place used to be crowded with horses, cows, sheep, every kind of all dogs, everything that people had to trade come in on court day and gather around this spot. Two, it was a great political stumping ground for politicians. I could not tell you the speakers who have lifted their voice in seeking office in this square to our back. The building immediately behind us is the fifth courthouse to stand on this spot. The first one was constructed in 1788. They were either burned or torn down because they were antiquated. The fourth courthouse contained the wonderful piece of Kentucky artistry, Woman Triumphant, by the famous artist, just a moment, I think Joel Tanner Hart. The courthouse burned down and destroyed that wonderful piece of statuary. I had an forearm of that graceful figure, which I gave to the University of Kentucky. So far as I know, that's the only existing relic of that. Here were conducted trials. Lawyers, a string of Kentucky famous lawyers, John Breckinridge, Caleb Wallace, George Nicholas, on down Henry Clay, on down through lawyers of the most famous of the Kentucky bars practiced in this courthouse across the street. That is one of its predecessors. Here it was, right after World War II, that the Army was called out, not the militia. The regular Army was called out to quell a lynch mob in the famous Leavitt trial, in which this square was seething with people with ropes and tar, threatening to lynch that Negro boy. The Army, veterans brought from the battlefield of France, stood off the mob, and the trial proceeded in an orderly way. It is also a square, a statuary of John Hunt Morgan's equestrian statue is over to our left. John Breckinridge's statue is here to our on Sheepside. This was the center of the business area of Lexington. Not only Lexington, but it was a kind of a commercial nerve center for all of eastern Kentucky and all of central Kentucky. Louisville, after 1820, became the major commercial city of the state.
Choosing a selection of the capital of the state, how was that done?
That's a pretty complicated issue. Of course, you would have thought they would have chosen one of the major towns in the state, like Lexington or Louisville, or Danville, for instance, or Harrodsburg, but they didn't. They went to Frankfort for various reasons, and I'm not sure that I'm entirely right about all of them, but one of the reasons, it was located near the center of Kentucky population at the time. It also was located on the river, easy access by water. The people of Frankfort supplied some materials and support for the building of a capital, and like all things, everlastingly, including the observation of the Ten Commandments in Kentucky, there's some kind of political implication involved.
Okay. Can you tell us just a little bit about yourself, besides the immense amounts of knowledge that you possess? How did you get interested in history?
I came to Kentucky in 1928 without knowing a single soul in this state. I got off the train down here on September the 14th, 1928, with 25,000 Kentucky Republicans milling around. I had never seen a Republican who wasn't a postmaster until I rode in the seat from Ashland down here with Charlie Curtis, who was running for vice president on the Hoover ticket. I came here as a student at the University of Kentucky, I was a graduate of the University of Mississippi, and I started work on my master's thesis in the field of Kentucky history, writing on the subject of trade in slaves, livestock, and hemp between this area and the lower South. And I became very much interested in the history of the state from that. And there's scarcely a day gone by in the last 60 years that somewhere or other I haven't been involved in doing something about the history of the state.
We also understand that you've written 20-plus books. Can you tell us what some of the books are about?
Well, I've published a history of Kentucky, the Exploring Kentucky, which was used a long time in the schools. I published the Kentucky in the Rivers of America series, the Rampaging Frontier, Frontier America, the Emerging South, Pills, Petticoats, and Plows, Southern Country Editor, and I've just published The Greening of the South, which has to do with reforestation and conservation of the southern land.
We were talking earlier about the changes that have been made. And when we've interviewed other people, we've asked them what changes they've seen take place. Can you tell us a little bit about the changes you've observed since you've been in Kentucky?
In the state or in the county?
In the state.
Oh, yes. Phenomenal changes. Despite all of the discussion of the educational system,